Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Epilepsy Foundation Eastern Pennsylvania's podcast series, Epilepsy End. My name is Missy Dolaway, and I'm the Director of Development for the Epilepsy Foundation Eastern Pennsylvania. This episode of Epilepsy End is sponsored by our partners at Penn Medicine and will be focusing on epilepsy and research.
Epilepsy End is a podcast sharing stories of hope from the patient community and the latest in medical advances. 1 in 26 people will develop epilepsy, but it's more than seizures. Join the Epilepsy Foundation Eastern Pennsylvania and become part of the conversation.
And it goes from the what may seem insignificant good things, to things that just you wouldn't expect. So I've lost a ton of weight unintentionally, and so that's good. You think that that's a good thing to be more healthy, but financially that means thousands of dollars to a lawyer in just buying clothes so you don't look ridiculous. I'm very serious. If you show up in court or to a client meeting and you're wearing clothes that are 4 times bigger than you,
Right.
you look like a child, and it's
Right.
preposterous.
Right.
But nobody thinks about that sort of a thing,
Mhm.
whether it's the condition or the medication or something else. That's part of it too.
This is Luke Debevec, an attorney working with epilepsy.
I work at a really large law firm in Philadelphia that's got places around the world, but my job is suing insurance companies who don't pay claims. And I've been doing that for some amount of time, and in the middle of my career, I started having seizures. And so that's been a big part of my life for the last 5 years. I'm being treated by Dr. Davis for that condition. I've got a family, 2 kids. It's something that I'm trying to live with and continue working through. I'm really trying to enjoy life despite everything that's going on, and I think I'm doing a pretty good job at that.
One of the funniest things that like, what was it, the last appointment where Luke started laughing, and I was like, "What are you laughing at?" And it turns out they have like the top 10 Dr. Davis statements, and so I kept on saying them, and he's clicking off in his brain. Oh, she said this, she said that. I have certain catchphrases that I use all the time, and I can't stop thinking about that. So I think about that almost every day.
This is Dr. Davis. Dr. Davis is the assistant professor of neurology at Penn. She's the medical director of the Epilepsy Monitoring Unit at Penn Epilepsy Center and winner of the American Academy of Neurology Dreyfus-Penry Epilepsy Award for her work in quantitative analysis of imaging and EEG data in epilepsy. She is also on the professional advisory board for the Epilepsy Foundation of America.
I was actually a neuroscience undergraduate major. Didn't know that's what I wanted to do, but I think the writing was on the wall that I would be a physician from a very young age, given the things that I was interested in school and the projects that I chose to do. When other kids chose to do projects on their favorite sports hero, I would do a project on diseases of the digestive system. So,
Epilepsy can be hard to diagnose, and people commonly mistake it for something else. Most people are diagnosed before age 20 or after age 65, so it can be even more confusing and scary when you start having seizures as an adult. There is often a period before the first signs of epilepsy in knowing when it is time to seek help. After having your first seizure, how long did it take for you to get to an epilepsy center?
Probably a number of weeks, if not months. I had initially had a seizure and almost disregarded it, because I didn't know what it was, and I thought it might have just been passing out from dehydration or something along those lines. But then it happened again, and I think I ended up in a hospital at that point and started being treated. And following some fits and starts, my wife took it upon herself to find some other options, and I ended up with Dr. Davis, who was kind enough to take me on as a patient.
It can be intimidating meeting with doctors for the first time. Because many patients experience either altered or loss of consciousness and can have trouble remembering the events surrounding a seizure, it helps to bring a friend or family member who can help provide information and support during those doctor visits.
That's definitely critical in most patients with epilepsy or people living with epilepsy, because for many patients, they're amnestic or they don't recall their own seizures. So critical to have a loved one or caregiver come to provide that history. Many of our patients don't even know if they've had seizures, so it can be tremendously helpful. If a caregiver doesn't come with a patient, I'm also often calling someone on the phone to try to get that history. If you're a new patient, bringing your prior records, and in particular bringing any kind of imaging, including any prior EEG on disk, can be very helpful for your provider. Unfortunately, we don't have a way to electronically transmit that kind of data yet. And for me, looking at the actual MRI, looking at the actual EEG is worth a million words in comparison to just the report. And then, of course, your prior records, although now with changes in electronic medical records, many records are available to your providers that don't need to be transferred over.
Once epilepsy enters your life, regular doctor visits are part of the deal. Having a plan can help. We asked Luke what he does to prepare for his doctor visits.
I guess it depends on how confident I'm feeling about what I remember on that day. If I don't recall what's gone on with seizures, I'm going to be bringing my wife, who is the person who knows about what's happening to me probably better than I do. If I've got a pretty good feel for what's happening, I'm going to come in by myself, but I'm going to bring notes. I'm a note taker now, and I never was before. Mm-hmm. I rely on notes to a large degree to make sure that short-term memory stuff just doesn't walk away. I'll bring a notepad with what I want to talk about, the issues that I think need to be addressed with Dr. Davis. And as I'm sitting there, I'm going to be taking down notes so that when I walk out of the appointment, I haven't just forgotten everything she said. It stinks to go home to my wife if she's not there and try to explain what happened and I don't have anything to say. Yeah. I have lots of different just notebooks and kind of note apps on my iPhone. I've tried different seizure logs, but they were too specific. I like just having an open book I can just take notes in.
1 in 26 people have epilepsy, but if you ask what it is, most people will simply say seizures or can't really explain it at all. The experience of epilepsy is extremely diverse and can be very hard to describe.
Epilepsy is one of those things that it's hard to explain to anyone who doesn't already have it or has experienced it. There's the seizure that you can see, and then there's everything else, which is kind of floating below. And all of that stuff is daily. But the seizures, that's the thing that everyone knows about. But you can go quite a long time between them and still be suffering. In terms of, working, you can deal with the physical aspect of it more easily. If you're an employer, as an accommodation, you can deal with, what do I do in the case of a seizure? Mm-hmm. It's a little more difficult to talk about, well, what do I do about the mental impacts of epilepsy? Right. And how do I help this person do their job to the best of their ability?
When epilepsy becomes a part of your life, it involves more than just your health. There's an adjustment period that takes time to figure out.
It's not an easy adjustment, but it's become easier with some relief from the seizures, which have come as a combination of both different medications, and I've been on a variety of them now, and then some of the options with surgery. That has not given me complete relief, but it's much less than it was. I'm now 49 days seizure-free.
After the break, Luke talks about how he pursued treatment and what works for him now. This episode is brought to you by Penn Medicine. Penn Medicine is a world-renowned academic medical center that ranks #1 in Philadelphia and top 10 in the U.S. The Penn Epilepsy Center is recognized by the National Association of Epilepsy Centers as a Level 4 epilepsy center. What does Level 4 mean? Level 4 epilepsy centers have the professional expertise and facilities to provide the highest level medical and surgical evaluation and treatment for patients with complex epilepsies. Visit pennmedicine.org for more information. That's pennmedicine.org. About 1 in 3 individuals taking anti-seizure medications still have seizures, and others get unwanted side effects. Individuals with epilepsy are in a special position to help others through participating in medical research that can lead to innovative and effective treatment options. Participating in a clinical trial is a significant commitment, and one should always have good understanding about the study and clinical trials in general before any agreement is made. To learn more about epilepsy research and how to join a clinical trial, visit efepa.org/research. Visit efepa.org/research. Epilepsy began being treated as a disease of the brain in 5th century BC when Hippocrates stated that a human could not be invaded by God. He suggested physical treatment, but unfortunately his views were not taken seriously until the 18th and 19th centuries. In the 19th century, neurology emerged as a new discipline, and the concept of epilepsy as a brain disorder became more widely accepted. Like any condition, there are options for treatment of epilepsy. Hospitals like Penn are working hard every day to create new treatments and improve upon the ones we already have.
NeuroPace responsive neurostimulator, the first intracranial implant, which is, I think, just the first of many, and will have advancements within that field. There's very recently a second intracranial device that stimulates the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. It's a type of deep brain stimulator that was approved by the FDA and will be clinically available very, very shortly. So those are two devices that I see as direct translations of research. I see as near to clinical use are many quantitative type approaches to improving function of those devices. So using machine learning to help the outcome of the devices we have, and then developing the next generation devices of tomorrow. The recent research that's come out in this field indicate that a good proportion, somewhere between 20 and 30% of patients, you may be able to find a hidden lesion just on the structural improvements in imaging from 3T MRI to 7T MRI. At Penn, our 7T MRI is the MRI that was clinically approved. However, we're using it only for research purposes. I do have permission, though, now that the FDA has approved the 7T, to share those images with the clinicians caring for the patient. The 7T MRI potentially can find hidden lesions not seen on 3T MRI. So most clinicians are really urging their patients to participate.
Medication is the first treatment option. This can be a difficult time of trial and error because not everyone reacts the same to medicine. It can take a while to figure out what is right for you.
I had a lot of different experiences with different medications. Some of the seizure reduction that I initially had came with some extreme mood changes with medication that were intolerable. Other medications that helped caused adverse physical reactions. The medications I'm on now seem to be pretty non-physical in terms of the adverse reactions. It's just pretty minor mental impact and a lot more seizure freedom than before. The emotional stuff is true, and I think it's different depending on the medication. Some of the medications directly impacted mood, and some of them are more questionable, and I don't know. The surgery is another question, too. You don't know where that impact is and what's the medication and what's the surgery. And I don't know how to break out all the different side effects and what's the cause of what. But there's other bizarre types of side effects that I've felt, things like appetite and taste. I don't taste food the same way I used to, and I don't know exactly the reason for that.
There are also surgical options. However, surgical exploration requires a lot of preparation. Not everyone with epilepsy may be a candidate or want to consider this as an option.
Any patient who has tried 2 seizure medications and is still having seizures should be seen by an epileptologist. That means an epilepsy specialist. There are many qualified centers in Philadelphia. Penn is one of them. That is now an American Academy of Neurology recommendation. So anyone listening to the podcast that fits into that category, I strongly urge that you see an epilepsy specialist to discuss potential surgical evaluation. Really, the pre-surgical process is a multidisciplinary, meaning many different physicians and providers are involved, and multimodality approach, meaning many different imaging methods and different tests are done. And we put all of those pieces together to try to decide whether a patient is a good surgical candidate. The first thing with the surgical evaluation is that for a standard resective type surgery, or now we're doing laser ablation, less invasive approaches, they need to have a focal type of epilepsy and not a generalized onset epilepsy. The vast majority, about 80% of epilepsy patients do have a focal, it's also called partial onset, there are many different words for that type of epilepsy. If a patient has not responded to medicine and has that type of epilepsy, their epileptologist will likely recommend as a next step a high-resolution 3T MRI and then referral into an inpatient epilepsy monitoring unit for usually between 5 and 7 days, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. It's a commitment and it's not fun. I would say it's a very boring place to be, but it's worthwhile. We get very good information there. We get to capture the seizures on the scalp EEG, get some localizing information there, and also see what happens during a patient's seizures. That's called seizure semiology, and that helps us know what part of the brain is causing the seizures. If we don't have enough dots connecting, but we have a good primary hypothesis or thought of where seizures are coming from, we often will recommend a next step of intracranial Eeg. At Penn, we're mostly doing something called stereotactic Eeg at this point, where EEG electrodes are inserted inside the brain through very, very small holes by the neurosurgeon. And then the patient comes back up to the epilepsy monitoring unit for video EEG monitoring again, and we try to finally localize where the seizures are coming from to better direct a more focal therapy and give them a higher chance of seizure freedom after surgical intervention. In preparation for coming in for intracranial EEG study, most patients will need some additional imaging studies. There may be other tests that the neurosurgeon recommends, so there may be several appointments prior to that study. You can expect to be in the hospital typically for 10 to 14 days, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, but it is another prolonged hospitalization. The recovery period, typically now with stereotactic EEG, is much faster than prior, but you're not going to go back to work the next day. It's an invasive study. I often will tell my trainees, residents, and fellows, I think it is the most invasive test in all of medicine.
It has been 5 years since Luke was first diagnosed with epilepsy. Now that he has figured out what works for him, he feels he is in a much better place.
I think it's a combination of the drugs that I'm on, and I had the laser ablation surgery about 1.5 years ago, June 9th of last year.
Laser ablation almost sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, but Dr. Davis explains this very real technology.
For some patients, we have enough of these tests matching up where we can recommend them to go directly to either a resective surgery, where a part of the brain is removed, or to a laser ablation, which is a new therapy that's being used extensively around the country that is better tolerated by patients, less time in the hospital, but really appropriate for certain subtypes of patients. Patients should certainly discuss with their providers. The advent of laser ablation does help with many patients being more willing to undergo epilepsy surgery. Laser ablation is still a surgical procedure. It's still taking away part of the brain. It's not resecting it, but it's burning it. But the patients only will have a small incision. They're in the hospital for one night. There's not that tremendous trepidation regarding a big brain surgery.
So now that we know what it is, what is the experience of laser ablation actually like?
It's intense, and the road to getting there is probably even more intense. But the surgery itself involves check-in to the hospital and a lot of chaos around you, and eventually they put you through an MRI and take a couple shots through your skull. But I was not there at the moment.
Or under anesthesia.
I was under anesthesia, but I woke up in extreme pain. I don't know if I understood exactly how many screws will go into your head during the surgery, but apparently there are some to hold your head in place so that you don't move while they're shooting you. And that's actually the part that hurt the most.
That's very unusual for most patients don't have that kind of discomfort, but it's certainly something with any surgery. You have to be aware that there can be pain and that your physicians will try to keep you as comfortable as possible.
The recovery was relatively simple, though. Once I was home, a little bit of pain meds and got off of those as quickly as I could and just kind of wait for things to heal. But I was doing work pretty much the next day from my hospital bed when needed and for things that only I could do.
Okay.
But I tried not to do any work wherever I could. I think I was back in the office within about 2 weeks. Pretty remarkable for brain surgery. I wasn't expecting that.
There have been, in the last just few years, tremendous advancements and introduction of therapies to this population of refractory epilepsy patients. I never look back and think that epilepsy wasn't the right subspecialty or part of medicine that I wanted to be in.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of Epilepsy and Research. And a big thank you to our sponsor of this episode, Penn Medicine. Next episode, we will talk about importance of research and how Luke is helping others.
I found other people at my firm who also had different types of disability, and suddenly we were all talking with each other and knowing other people and supporting them. And the group's just grown every year since then. That was about 5 years ago, and now we might have 80 people. Initially, it was 3.
Keep an eye out for our next episode of Epilepsy Ends, which will be released on a monthly basis. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcast. You can also visit efepa.org for more resources or to find our podcast. This is your host, Missy Dolaway. Until next time. Join the Epilepsy Foundation, Eastern Pennsylvania, as we celebrate champions in our local epilepsy community at the 2019 Mardi Gras Gala on February 22nd. Visit mardigras.philly.org to learn more and purchase tickets.
Epilepsy And is produced by the Epilepsy Foundation, Eastern Pennsylvania.